Linus Torvalds is 54, Greg Crower-Hartman is 55, and whilst there are certainly a lot of younger people around the kernel, especially those employed by a company to work on the kernel, a lot of the maintainers and a lot of subsystems are run by people around this age range, and they're certainly not getting any younger. Now, this is not a new observation. It has been discussed way back in 2013. Aging Linux kernel community is looking for younger participants. Again in 2017, aging Linux kernel developers seek fresh talent, and again in 2024, the greying open source community needs fresh blood. Now let me be very clear, the Linux kernel especially, but even just the FOSS world generally, is in no danger of dying. The Linux kernel is an incredibly crucial piece of architecture. There are a lot of people that work on the project. Yes, it would be bad if some of the big names like Linus Torvalds, Greg Crower-Hartman, and other people in that sort of position end up retiring, because that's what is going to eventually happen, but there are a lot of other talented people either employed to work on the kernel, volunteers on the kernel, up-and-coming developers who in a couple of years are going to be really big names. There is no danger of the project dying, and the same thing for the rest of the FOSS world as well. People are always going to make software and always going to make it open source. If you ask me again in 20 or 30 years, maybe I'll have a different estimation by then, but at least in the short to midterm, there is nothing to be worried about here. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't issues that might become a lot worse in the future, like the fact that a lot of the kernel development processes, whilst they were popular at one point, nowadays are basically the kernel development processes, and you need to learn them to work on the kernel. A great example of this is everything is done through a kernel mailing list. If you want to go and contribute code, this is done by emailing patches. There is a lot of wonky or non-existent kernel documentation where the way that you learn it is being very experienced with the kernel and learn how the codebase works, which really does make it difficult to bring people on. But because the kernel is such a crucial project, people do it anyway. If it was some random terminal, yeah, we see how that goes. But do you know who else has talked about the aging kernel developers? Linus Torvalds himself. Now, obviously, you know, he is a little bit biased. He is one of the aging kernel developers, but at least from his perspective, he doesn't see it as a bad thing. In fact, there are good things to come from it. This article is based on a talk that Linus Torvalds and Dirk Hondo had back at the Open Source Summit Europe in Vienna. Also keep in mind that when Linus started the kernel, which depending on how you define the start, whether it's when he had the idea, when he sent the email, when the first version came out, he was around 22. Linus is as aware as anyone could possibly be that he's been around in the project for quite a while, and a lot of other people have been as well. And here is what Linus first had to say on this. It is absolutely true that Linux kernel maintainers are aging, but there is a positive spin on that. How many open source projects have maintainers that have literally been around over 3 decades? It is very unusual, so when people say developers burn out and go away, yes, that's true, but that's kind of normal. What is not normal is that people actually stay around for decades. That's the unusual thing, and I think that's to some degree a good sign. I can certainly think of a lot of projects that have been around this long, whether it's x386 into Xorg, GNU, just generally GNU, 386 BSD into the modern BSDs. But how many of those early developers are still around working on those projects? There are certainly some, don't get me wrong, but a lot of other people have left to go into other projects, maybe moved out of a development role, moved into more of a management role, and a lot of other people just, you know, are not around anymore. And burnout certainly does play a part, but burnout isn't all of it. Some people just move on to a new stage in their life. They maybe worked a job working on the kernel, and then they move on to another job. They no longer do so. Or maybe they did so in their spare time, and maybe they need to work more now, maybe they have kids, and just no longer have time to work on the kernel. And when it is burnout, it's not always boredom with the project. it can be brought on through other things as well. This article talks about the whole Rust for Linux thing, where one of the lead developers of Rust for Linux decided to just step out of the project because there was a lot of non-technical nonsense that was being the focus of everything, because a lot of people in the kernel just refused to accept that Rust might have a place in the kernel, that stuff they did with C just doesn't really make sense anymore, and there might be a better way to do it. And instead of focusing on the actual, like, this is what is good, this is what is bad, a lot of the discussions were focused around just unrelated nonsense, basically. It was completely understandable that there would be pushback, but much like in Wayland, where, you know, some of the discussions end up just being, you're a bad person, the kernel is no stranger to that either. Now, initially, this next part is going to sound kind of backwards, but by the end, it hopefully is going to make sense. I think part of the issue with us having a lot of developers is that we've always had a lot of people who are very competent and could step up. Greg hasn't always been Greg. Before Greg, there were Andrews and Allens, and after Greg, there'll be Shannons and Steves. There are people who have been around for decades, and the real issue is that you have to have a person or a group that people in the development community can trust. And part of trust is fundamentally about having been around for long enough that people know how you work. Whilst the kernel does have a lot of corporate developers, the kernel in and of itself is not a corporate project with a corporate business structure. What I mean by this is you can't just have some random person come along and be promoted to being the manager, and then everybody just has to pretend like they respect you. That's just not how this works. For a FOSS project to be in a healthy state, you need to have someone who is in a leadership position that people firstly know, but people also know what they're about. Now, the problem is to have this, you need to have them doing a bunch of different notable things, maintaining different subsystems, running different parts of the project, merging different things, writing important code, and things like this. And this works great when you don't have that many people, but when you have a lot of competent people, a lot of people doing incredible work, you can work on one subsystem and know a bunch of incredible people there, but have absolutely no idea that a whole nother subsystem has incredible people over there as well. You've never even heard their names. When there are a lot of people, what you need to do to stand out from the crowd and how long you need to be around for ends up becoming a bigger and bigger and bigger barrier. However, Torvalds acknowledged that such an ecosystem can be daunting and difficult for younger or less experienced developers to enter, especially when they see incumbents who have been around for so long. But despite that, there are newcomers who manage to make their way into the heart of the Linux project. A great example of this is the graphics subsystem. There is a lot of people in graphics development who aren't over 50, who aren't over 40, who I'm pretty sure a lot of them aren't over 30. There is a lot of younger people working on that. Now, obviously, that is a very complex part of the kernel to be in. To be fair, a lot of the kernel is a very complex part of the kernel to be in, but if you are dedicated enough and you want to do it, it can be done. It's just, you need to learn how the kernel development processes actually work. We have core developers that are top-level maintainers for major subsystems who've come up in just a few years. It's not instant, but there are new people who come in, and 3 years later, they are a main developer. It is not impossible at all. I think we have a fairly healthy developer subsystem, but the whole monkey dance about developers, we've got them. The fact that we also have old, graying people around, I don't see that as a huge problem. Whilst I did bring up the kernel development processes earlier being kind of like a bit of a barrier to entry, because this is such a critical infrastructure, it sort of gets away with just doing whatever it wants, right? Like, if you want to get involved in the kernel, they could be using like SVN or anything else. You would learn how to use it just because of the fact that it is the Linux kernel. So yes, mailing lists are like a kind of outdated way of doing things. Emailing patches, kind of outdated way of doing things. Look, it could be nice if things were done with a modern development platform like basically every other project out there. But It is such an important project that you are going to learn it if you want to get involved with it. The Linux kernel is the Linux kernel. I don't think there is another project of that caliber in the entire FOSS world. If you can think of one, please let me know. Maybe you could argue the GNU toolchain, but nowadays there is a lot of replacements for that as well. I don't think you can really argue anything else. I don't ever expect there to be an issue of like competent developers to work on the kernel. There's clearly a lot of people who are able to do so. What I am apprehensive about and kind of concerned about is what happens after Linus steps down from his role. Because right now, Greg is in a position to take that over. And I'm sure someone is going to replace Greg as well. But does the same development system stay in place? Do we still have the whole Linus Git tree? Do we have a single person being the one who's merging patches into the actual project? Or does the old BDFL model fall apart and something new needs to be done? Will a younger successor be named? Or will something else have to happen? Only time is going to ultimately tell what is going to go on here. I'm curious, though. I'm definitely very curious. But what do you think? Do you think there are any concerns around the aging kernel developer ecosystem? Or do you think it's something just, it's okay, we'll work it out as we go? I would love to know. So if you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really liked the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe to Libera page linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and write code.
Like this.